A lawn flamingo was all it took to ignite a neighborhood war. When Susan discovered her prized lawn ornament had been secretly removed, little did she know it was the city's beloved mascot. Now, she's facing a hefty fine and the wrath of an entire community, a twist of fate that will change this quiet suburb forever. Susan stared in disbelief at the official-looking notice in her hands. The Homeowners Association had fined her $500 for unauthorized lawn ornamentation. Her heart pounded as she read the words, gripping the paper tightly. How could this be happening? That flamingo had been the centerpiece of her front yard for years. Rage bubbled inside her as she stormed out the front door, eyes scanning the pristine lawns of her neighbors. They were the ones responsible for this. She knew it. Susan marched down the street, determined to get to the bottom of this outrage. As she approached the HOA president's house, she could see the woman peering out the window, a smug expression on her face. "Mrs. Hendricks," Susan shouted, pounding on the door. "I demand an explanation for this ridiculous fine." The door swung open, and there stood the HOA president, Barbara Hendricks, in all her perfectly coiffed glory. "Susan, how nice of you to stop by," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'd assume you're referring to the citation we issued for your lawn ornament." "Yes, I am," Susan snapped. "That flamingo has been part of my yard for years. Why are you suddenly making a problem out of it?" Barbara's eyes narrowed. "The flamingo is in violation of our community guidelines. You know the rules, Susan." "No, tacky decorations are allowed." Susan felt her blood boil. "Tacky? That flamingo is a treasured part of my home." "How dare you?" "The decision has been made," Barbara interrupted, her tone final. "You have 2 weeks to remove the flamingo or face further fines. Good day." She turned and closed the door, leaving Susan seething on the doorstep. Clenching her fists, Susan marched back to her house, her mind racing. There was no way she was going to let the HOA bully her into removing her beloved lawn ornament. She had to find a way to fight this, no matter the cost. Over the next few days, Susan pored over the HOA bylaws, searching for any loophole that could help her case. She knew the rules were strict, but there had to be a way around this. As she scanned the pages, an idea began to form in her mind. Determined, she made her way to City Hall, determined to uncover the truth. The receptionist eyed her warily as she approached the counter. "I need information about the city's flamingo mascot," Susan said, her voice firm. The receptionist blinked in surprise. "The flamingo mascot? I'm not sure I understand." "Yes, the city's flamingo mascot," Susan repeated. "I've been fined by the HOA for having one in my yard, and I need to know more about it." The receptionist hesitated, then began typing furiously on her computer. After a few moments, her eyes widened. "Oh my goodness, you're absolutely right," she said, looking up at Susan. "The flamingo is the official mascot of our city. It's been that way for over a decade." Susan felt a surge of triumph. "I knew it. Can you please provide me with any documentation or information about this?" The receptionist nodded, quickly printing out a stack of papers. "Here you go. This should have everything you need to fight that ridiculous fine." Susan thanked the receptionist and hurried back home, her mind racing. With this information, she was confident she could put an end to the HOA's harassment. She just had to find the right way to approach it. As she sat at her kitchen table, poring over the documents, a plan began to take shape. Susan knew she had to be strategic, but she was determined to come out on top. This was her home, and she wasn't going to let the HOA take that away from her. The next day, Susan marched into the HOA meeting, her stack of documents in hand. The other residents eyed her warily as she approached the front of the room, where Barbara Hendricks sat at the head of the table, an unpleasant smile on her face. "Thank you all for being here," Barbara began, her gaze settling on Susan. "I'm sure you're all aware of the recent issue with a certain lawn ornament in our community." Susan took a deep breath and stepped forward. That's exactly why I'm here, Mrs. Hendricks. I have information that I believe will change your mind about this fine. Barbara's brow furrowed. Oh, and what information might that be? Susan placed the documents on the table, sliding them across to Barbara. As it turns out, the flamingo in my yard is the official mascot of our city. It's been that way for over a decade. A hush fell over the room as Barbara leafed through the papers, her expression shifting from one of smugness to one of disbelief. This can't be, she muttered, her eyes widening. But it is, Susan said, her voice firm. And I have the documentation to prove it. I'm not going to remove my lawn ornament, and I'm certainly not going to pay this ridiculous fine. Barbara's face flushed with embarrassment as the other residents began murmuring amongst themselves. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. Well, this is certainly unexpected, she said, her voice shaky. The board will need to discuss this further before making a decision. I'm sure you will, Susan replied, a hint of triumph in her voice. But I can assure you, I'm not going anywhere. This flamingo is staying put. With that, she turned and strode out of the meeting, leaving the HOA members in a state of stunned silence. The next few days were tense in the neighborhood. Susan could feel the disapproving glares of her neighbors as she tended to her lawn, the flamingo standing tall and proud in the center of her yard. She knew the HOA wouldn't take this lying down, and she braced herself for their next move. Sure enough, a few days later, Susan received another notice in the mail. This time, it was a warning of further fines and possible legal action if she didn't remove the flamingo within a week. Undeterred, Susan marched back to City Hall, determined to get an official proclamation declaring the flamingo as the city's mascot. The receptionist was more than happy to assist, and within a matter of hours, Susan had a formal document in her hands. Armed with this new evidence, Susan returned to the HOA meeting, ready to face off against Barbara Hendricks and her cronies. As you can see, Susan said, holding up the proclamation, the city has officially recognized the flamingo as our community's mascot. Any attempts to fine or remove it would be a direct violation of our local laws. Barbara's face twisted with fury, her eyes narrowing. This is outrageous. You can't just flaunt the rules because of some technicality. Technicality? Susan scoffed. This is a legally binding declaration from the city. Your fines are invalid, and I expect a full refund for the one you've already issued. The other residents murmured in agreement, some even nodding their heads in support of Susan. Barbara looked around the room, her composure slipping. This is unacceptable. We cannot have a tacky lawn ornament ruining the aesthetic of our community. Tacky. Susan's voice rose in volume. This flamingo is a symbol of our city's heritage. How dare you try to erase it? The argument escalated, with both women trading accusations and threats. The other residents watched in stunned silence, unsure of whose side to take. Finally, Barbara slammed her hand on the table, silencing the room. Fine, Susan. Keep your flamingo. But mark my words, this isn't over. In the days that followed, the tension in the neighborhood reached a fever pitch. Susan could feel the icy glares of her neighbors as she went about her daily routine, the flamingo standing tall in her yard. She knew that Barbara Hendricks and the HOA were plotting their next move, and she braced herself for the worst. One afternoon, as Susan was tending to her garden, she heard a commotion coming from the street. Rushing to the front of her house, she was shocked to see her beloved flamingo lying on the ground, its neck broken. No, she cried, rushing to the fallen ornament. As she knelt beside it, she noticed a scrap of paper tucked under one of the legs. Hands trembling, she unfolded it and read the message scrawled in a familiar handwriting. This is just the beginning. Fury and fear coursed through Susan's veins as she realized that Barbara and the HOA were behind this act of sabotage. She immediately called the police, reporting the vandalism and the threatening note. The officers arrived quickly, surveying the scene and taking statements from Susan and her neighbors. However, despite their best efforts, they were unable to gather any concrete evidence that pointed to the HOA's involvement. Frustrated and feeling helpless, Susan spent the next few days in a state of constant vigilance, her eyes scanning the neighborhood for any signs of further retaliation. The once peaceful community had descended into a war zone, with neighbors eyeing each other with suspicion and distrust. As the days turned into weeks, Susan's resolve only grew stronger. She refused to back down, determined to defend her beloved Flamingo and stand up to the HOA's bullying tactics. But she knew that the battle had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever before. Undeterred by the destruction of her Flamingo, Susan set out to find a replacement. She scoured the city, finally locating a supplier who had a similar ornament in stock. With a renewed sense of determination, she had the new Flamingo installed in her yard, standing tall and proud once again. But the relief was short-lived. Just days later, Susan awoke to the sound of commotion outside. Peering through the window, she was horrified to see a group of her neighbors, led by Barbara Hendricks, gathering in front of her house. "This ends today, Susan," Barbara shouted, her voice carrying across the street. "Your Flamingo is an eyesore and a blight on our community. We won't stand for it any longer." Susan rushed outside, her heart pounding. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her eyes darting from one neighbor to the next. "We're taking matters into our own hands," Barbara replied, a smug expression on her face. "This Flamingo has to go, one way or another." Before Susan could react, the crowd surged forward, grabbing the Flamingo and attempting to pull it from the ground. Susan jumped in front of them, arms outstretched, desperately trying to protect her beloved ornament. "Stop," she cried. "You can't do this. The Flamingo is the city's mascot, and I have the documentation to prove it." But her pleas fell on deaf ears as the crowd continued to tug and yank at the Flamingo, determined to remove it from her yard. Susan felt tears of frustration welling up in her eyes as she watched her prized possession being destroyed. Suddenly, a loud siren pierced the air, and flashing blue lights appeared at the end of the street. The crowd froze, realizing that the police had been called. Reluctantly, they began to disperse, leaving Susan standing alone in her yard, her Flamingo still standing, but with visible damage. As the officers approached, Susan knew that this battle was far from over. The police officers took statements from both Susan and her neighbors, but without concrete evidence of who was responsible for the attempted vandalism, they were unable to take any immediate action. Susan, however, was undeterred. She knew that the HOA and her neighbors were not going to stop until they got their way, and she was determined to fight them every step of the way. In the days that followed, Susan spent hours poring over the city's laws and regulations, searching for any loopholes or technicalities that could help her case. She knew that the Flamingo was the official city mascot, but she needed to find a way to solidify its legal status and protect it from further attacks. Finally, after countless hours of research, Susan discovered an obscure city ordinance that granted special protection to any historically significant landmarks or symbols within the community. Buoyed by this new information, she marched down to City Hall and filed a formal petition to have the Flamingo recognized as a protected landmark. The process was arduous, with the HOA and several of her neighbors fighting tooth and nail to prevent the designation. But Susan refused to back down, tirelessly advocating for her beloved Flamingo and the city's heritage. After weeks of heated debates and legal wrangling, the city council finally reached a decision. In a dramatic public hearing, they announced that the Flamingo would be officially recognized as a protected landmark, granting it the full force of the law. Susan couldn't contain her joy as the ruling was announced, her eyes brimming with tears of triumph. The HOA and her neighbors, on the other hand, were left seething with frustration, their attempts to remove the Flamingo thwarted at every turn. As Susan returned home, the Flamingo standing tall and proud in her yard, she couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment. She had stood up to the HOA's bullying tactics and won, proving that even the smallest symbols of a community's identity were worth fighting for. In the aftermath of the city council's ruling, the neighborhood remained in a state of uneasy truce. The HOA and Susan's neighbors had reluctantly accepted the Flamingo's protected status, but their resentment continued to simmer beneath the surface. Barbara Hendricks, in particular, seemed unwilling to let the matter go. She began to stir up discontent among the other residents, whispering of unfair special treatment and the erosion of community values. Slowly but surely, a new wave of opposition began to take shape. Susan, sensing the looming threat, knew that she couldn't let her guard down. She continued to vigilantly monitor her yard, ready to spring into action at the first sign of trouble. And sure enough, her vigilance paid off when, one night, she spotted a group of her neighbors creeping around the Flamingo under the cover of darkness. Without hesitation, Susan rushed outside, confronting the would-be vandals. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and outrage. The neighbors, caught off guard, scattered like startled rabbits, disappearing into the shadows. But Susan knew that this was just the beginning. The war for her beloved Flamingo was far from over. In the days that followed, Susan found herself the target of an escalating campaign of harassment and intimidation. Her tires were slashed, her mailbox was vandalized, and she even received anonymous threats in the mail. The HOA, it seemed, was willing to stop at nothing to remove the Flamingo from her yard. Undeterred, Susan continued to fight back, rallying the support of the city council and local media. She knew that the battle was not just about a lawn ornament, but about the very essence of her community, its history, its identity, and its commitment to diversity and inclusion. As the conflict reached a fever pitch, with both sides digging in their heels, Susan realized that the only way to end this feud was to take the battle to the public arena. She organized a rally, inviting the entire community to come together and celebrate the Flamingo as a symbol of their shared heritage. To Susan's delight, thousands of residents showed up, their voices united in support of the beloved mascot. The HOA and its supporters, faced with the overwhelming public outcry, were forced to concede defeat. The Flamingo would remain, a testament to the power of community and the importance of standing up for what's right. In the end, Susan's unwavering determination had prevailed, and the Flamingo stood tall, a symbol of her victory over the forces of intolerance and oppression. It was a lesson that would reverberate through the neighborhood for years to come, a reminder that even the smallest of battles can have the power to transform a community.